Shaq was just there for his morning coffee when a wealthy woman shoved past him, cutting the line. "People like you don't belong here," she sneered. The cafe fell silent. Eyes turned. A few customers pulled out their phones ready to record. But Shaq just smiled. What he did next would turn the tables in a way no one saw coming. It humiliated her, stunned the crowd, and shook the entire internet. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Beanhaven Cafe buzzed with the morning rush. Baristas calling out names, coffee machines hissing, and the low hum of conversation filling the air. The scent of freshly brewed espresso mingled with the sweet aroma of pastries, creating a comforting atmosphere. Customers, dressed in everything from business suits to gym gear, shuffled forward in line, eager for their caffeine fix. Shaq stood near the counter, towering over the crowd, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. His presence was hard to ignore, yet he blended in, waiting patiently like everyone else. Just as he stepped forward to order, a woman in a tailored white blazer and designer heels pushed past him, her expensive perfume trailing in the air. "Excuse me, miss, but I think you just cut in front of me," Shaq said, his deep voice calm yet firm. The woman barely spared him a glance. "Oh, please, just order your cheap coffee and move on," she said, waving a manicured hand dismissively. A ripple of unease passed through the cafe. A few customers exchanged knowing glances, whispering among themselves. They recognized Shaq instantly. But Karen Whitman, oblivious to the man she had just disrespected, remained unfazed as she tapped her nails impatiently on the counter. Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Man, it's way too early for this," he muttered under his breath. The barista hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. Should they serve Karen or acknowledge Shaq, who had rightfully been next? But before they could decide, Karen snapped her fingers. "Hello? I'd like my usual," she said, her voice dripping with entitlement. The tension in the cafe thickened. Shaq simply stepped back, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. The barista, caught in an awkward dilemma, hesitantly prepared Karen's order first. She took the coffee with a satisfied smirk, turning back to Shaq with mock sympathy. "See? Was that so hard? You could learn some patience, big guy." Then, without warning, she tilted the cup forward. The steaming coffee splashed onto Shaq's hoodie, dark liquid seeping into the fabric. Gasps rippled through the cafe as the entire room seemed to freeze. A few people instinctively stepped back, waiting for the explosion, but Shaq didn't move. He looked down at his soaked shirt, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Karen's, his expression unreadable. "Oops," Karen said with a smirk, her voice dripping with insincerity. "Guess you should have stayed quiet." The cafe fell into complete silence. All eyes locked onto Shaq. Would he retaliate? Would he snap? Karen crossed her arms, still oblivious to the gravity of her mistake. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head, his massive frame eerily calm. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The rich aroma of coffee still hung in the air, but the energy inside Beanhaven Cafe had shifted entirely. A charged silence settled over the room, thick with anticipation. Every eye in the cafe was glued to the scene unfolding at the counter. Shaq stood still, his massive frame towering over Karen. His hoodie, once a crisp shade of gray, was now soaked with dark streaks of coffee. Drops of the hot liquid dripped onto the tiled floor, forming tiny puddles at his feet. He exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening for a brief moment before he relaxed his shoulders. His deep voice was steady but firm. "You just ruined my morning." Karen, completely unfazed, gave a small smirk. "You'll survive," she said, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder like she had just dismissed an inconvenience. A murmur rippled through the cafe. Some customers whispered to one another, their expressions ranging from shock to curiosity. Others did more than just watch. Several patrons had discreetly pulled out their phones, capturing the exchange on video. A few cameras were already rolling, their lenses aimed at the entitled woman who had just disrespected a global icon without even realizing it. At that moment, the cafe's manager, Tyler, rushed forward. He was a wiry man in his early 30s, wearing a Beanhaven apron over a button-up shirt. His expression was laced with panic as he placed himself between Shaq and Karen. "Ma'am, you can't just—" Tyler started, but Karen cut him off instantly. "Oh, relax," she scoffed, rolling her eyes. She turned her attention back to Shaq, her tone dripping with condescension. It's just a little coffee. Don't be so dramatic. Shaq's lips pressed together, his expression unreadable. Tyler's face was turning red, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. Ma'am, this isn't acceptable. You need to apologize. Karen let out a dry laugh, throwing her hands up. Apologize? For what? Accidentally spilling my drink? Please, she said, shaking her head. This is ridiculous. A woman in the crowd standing near the sugar station muttered, That wasn't an accident. A few heads nodded in agreement, but Karen ignored them. She placed a hand on her hip and shot Tyler an impatient glare. Look, I practically own this place. You don't want to make a big deal out of this. A few employees standing behind the counter exchanged nervous glances. Tyler swallowed hard, looking like he was caught between his job and his morals. Karen smirked, tapping her nails against the counter. So can we hurry this up? I have important places to be. The cafe was completely silent, but the tension was deafening. Shaq's fingers flexed at his sides. His next move? Karen would never see it coming. Shaq's lips curled into a smirk, his broad frame still as he watched Karen gloat. You own this place? That's so? His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, a quiet challenge beneath the words. Karen crossed her arms and tilted her head, her confidence unwavering. Not literally, she admitted with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. But I'm here every day. The owners love me. Tyler, the cafe manager, visibly tensed. He looked around nervously, sensing the growing tension in the room. Ma'am, please, he tried again, his voice tight. We have policies against... Oh, shut up, Tyler, Karen snapped, not even looking at him. You're just a manager. You don't make the rules. The cafe staff behind the counter exchanged uncomfortable glances. The murmurs from the surrounding customers grew louder. Some whispered in shock, while others simply watched, waiting to see how far she'd go. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head slightly. You sure the owners love you? Karen scoffed, her smirk widening. Of course they do, she said smugly. I bring in the right kind of people. The regulars, not randoms. She gestured vaguely at Shaq, her tone laced with something that made several people in the cafe shift uncomfortably. Shaq's eyes darkened slightly, but he stayed composed. He leaned on the counter, his massive presence making the space feel smaller. So, what you're saying is, he began slowly, you think you're more important than everybody else here? Karen didn't hesitate. I don't think. I know. A quiet gasp came from a barista near the espresso machine. Another customer muttered, She really doesn't know who she's talking to. But Karen didn't care. She was too busy basking in her own arrogance. Listen, she sighed, brushing imaginary dust off her expensive blouse. I could have you banned if I wanted. A few people in the cafe let out soft chuckles, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Shaq, still smirking, straightened to his full height, towering over her. His next words? They would change everything. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head as he wiped the remnants of Karen's spilled coffee from his shirt. His deep, rumbling laughter echoed through the cafe, breaking the tense silence that had settled over the room. The smirk on his face remained steady as he looked her directly in the eyes, his towering frame making the moment even more imposing. Lady, he said, his voice calm but firm, you got no idea who you just messed with. Karen rolled her eyes, exhaling in exasperation, as if the whole situation were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Oh, please, she scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. What? You think you're important or something? The cafe remained eerily silent, with only the occasional sound of a milk frother hissing from behind the counter. A few customers exchanged nervous glances, some gripping their coffee cups a little tighter as they sensed the shift in energy. The young barista behind the counter, a petite woman with a ponytail and wide, startled eyes, hesitated before leaning in slightly toward Karen, her voice low but urgent. That's Shaquille O'Neal, she whispered, as if saying it out loud would somehow make the situation even more real. Karen barely reacted at first, letting out a short laugh as if the very idea was ridiculous. Yeah, right, she said, waving the barista off. If he were Shaquille O'Neal, why would he be here? The cafe manager, Tyler, shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, rubbing the back of his neck as he cleared his throat. He had been hesitant to intervene, but now that Karen was digging herself deeper, he knew he had to say something. Because he owns this place, he said carefully, his tone carrying enough weight to make Karen's entire body go rigid. For the first time since she had strutted into the cafe, Karen didn't have a quick-witted remark or a dismissive scoff ready. Her head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing as if daring him to repeat himself. "Excuse me?" Shaq didn't answer her immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and with a few swift taps on the screen, found exactly what he was looking for. He turned the screen toward her, holding it up so there would be no room for doubt. The headline was impossible to miss. NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal officially invests in Beanhaven Cafe, expanding his business empire. The article was accompanied by a high-resolution photo of Shaq himself, standing beside a group of business executives in front of the very cafe they were in now. His large hand was firmly shaking that of another man in a suit, a wide grin on his face as they finalized the deal. Karen's eyes flickered over the screen, her expression shifting from skepticism to realization. The color visibly drained from her face, her normally smug demeanor faltering in an instant. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Shaq, still maintaining his composure, took one final swipe at his now stained shirt with a napkin. His voice was lighter now, almost amused, but there was an unmistakable edge to his tone. "Funny thing," he mused, glancing at Karen's stunned expression before pocketing his phone. "Not only am I important," he took a small step forward, closing the distance between them ever so slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make sure she felt the weight of his words. "I do own this place." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's smirk had vanished completely. For the first time, her carefully maintained aura of superiority wavered, replaced by something she wasn't used to feeling: uncertainty. She blinked, her mouth opening slightly as if searching for words, but nothing came out. Tyler, standing just behind the counter, let out a breath and nodded. "It's true," he said, his voice carrying through the cafe. "Shaq became a major investor in Beanhaven a few months ago." Karen whipped her head toward him, her eyes wide with disbelief. But I come here all the time," she stammered, her voice rising slightly as if that somehow changed the reality of the situation. "I know the staff. I know the menu by heart. I'm practically part of the place." Shaq exhaled sharply, shaking his head with a small, amused smile. "Yeah," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And now you just disrespected the owner." The weight of those words settled over the cafe like a thick fog. Customers who had been quietly watching suddenly exchanged knowing glances. A few of them chuckled under their breath, some even whispering to each other about how Karen had finally met her match. One man near the window leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee with a smirk. "Man, this is better than my morning news," he muttered to himself. Karen, now visibly flustered, turned in a slow circle, as if looking for some kind of support, someone to come to her defense. But the same people who used to politely nod at her, the ones who had tolerated her entitlement, were now watching her with amusement. Her breath hitched slightly. She wasn't used to being the one on the receiving end of humiliation. Her carefully built reputation of being the woman who always got what she wanted, who could walk into any room and own it, was crumbling before her eyes. I'm sorry," she suddenly blurted out, her voice higher than usual. "It was just a joke." Shaq raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "A joke?" he repeated, tilting his head slightly. Karen nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I mean, come on," she let out a nervous laugh. "It's just coffee. No harm done, right?" Her words hung in the air, but nobody seemed convinced. Tyler's expression hardened, and the baristas behind the counter exchanged looks. Shaq sighed, rubbing his jaw as he studied her. "Nah," he said finally. "It's more than just coffee." Karen swallowed hard, gripping the strap of her designer purse like a lifeline. I didn't mean to offend you," she said quickly. Shaq let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "Lady," he said, his voice deep and steady, "I don't think you understand what happens next." The cafe fell into an eerie silence. Shaq leaned against the counter, his massive frame completely still, his eyes locked onto Karen with an expression that was impossible to read. The cafe remained silent, the tension thick in the air, as Karen awkwardly shifted from one foot to the other, clearly scrambling to find a way out of the situation she had created for herself. She forced a nervous laugh, though it came out uneven. "Come on, it's just coffee," she said, flipping her hair over her shoulder in a weak attempt to maintain composure. "Let's not make a big deal out of nothing." Shaq didn't flinch. He just shook his head slowly. "Nah," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about respect." Karen's forced smile faltered, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. She glanced around, hoping for some kind of backup from the customers or the staff, but nobody looked sympathetic. Tyler, standing behind the counter, crossed his arms. The baristas, who usually had to bite their tongues around rude customers, were watching with barely contained satisfaction. Tyler took a deep breath, stepping forward. "Ma'am, I think it's best if you leave." Karen's head snapped toward him. "Excuse me." "You heard him," Shaq said simply. For the first time in a long time, Karen Whitman felt powerless. She had spent years walking into places like this, demanding the best service, treating employees as if they were beneath her. She had never once been challenged until now. Her cheeks flushed as she let out a sharp breath. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," she scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "I've been coming here for years. I'm practically part of this place." "Not anymore," Tyler said, his voice more confident than before. Karen's jaw dropped slightly. "What?" Shaq took a step closer, his presence towering over her. "You disrespected my staff," he said, nodding toward Tyler and the baristas. "You disrespected the customers, and you thought you could do it without consequences." Karen's hands clenched into fists. "This is insane. I I didn't do anything wrong. You can't just kick me out over a spilled drink." "It wasn't just about the drink," Shaq replied. His tone wasn't angry. He didn't need to be. His presence alone carried enough weight to make his point. "It was the way you acted, like you owned the place, like you were better than everyone else." Karen took a shaky step back, her confidence cracking. I'll leave," she stammered. "But you're not serious about banning me, right?" Shaq tilted his head, his smirk returning. The entire café watched, waiting for his answer. Karen's hands trembled as she looked around the café, desperately searching for a friendly face, someone who might step in and save her from this nightmare. But the crowd of customers, baristas, and staff all wore the same expression. Satisfaction. The same people who had once endured her entitled attitude were now watching her squirm, and not one of them seemed inclined to come to her defense. She let out a nervous chuckle, flicking her blonde hair over her shoulder as she tried to regain control of the situation. Okay, maybe I overreacted," she said, her voice unnaturally high-pitched. "But it was just an accident. I didn't mean to spill coffee on you." Tyler scoffed from behind the counter. "That's not what it looked like." Shaq crossed his arms, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, so it was an accident now?" Karen swallowed hard. I mean, I was just joking. I didn't think you'd take it so seriously." Shaq tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You don't look so tough now." Her face burned with embarrassment. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was used to getting her way, to brushing off consequences with a smug smile and a well-placed insult. But this time, she had no power, no control. She took a deep breath, her voice turning softer, more pleading. "Mr. O'Neill, please," she said, forcing out a small, fake laugh. "I love this place. I come here every day. I don't want to be banned." Shaq leaned in slightly, his massive frame towering over her. "Why shouldn't I?" Karen blinked rapidly, her mind racing for an excuse, but she had nothing. The silence in the cafe stretched uncomfortably long, and for the first time, she felt what it was like to be on the other side of humiliation. Finally, Shaq sighed, shaking his head as if he were disappointed. "All right," he said, stepping back slightly. "Let's make this real interesting." Karen's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean?" Shaq's smirk returned, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "You want to keep coming here? Then you gotta earn it." The cafe erupted in whispers. Karen's face paled as she realized she might not like where this was going. Karen's mouth fell open, her face a mix of shock and indignation. You can't be serious," she stammered, eyes darting around the cafe as if searching for someone, anyone, to tell her this was some kind of joke. But no one did. In fact, most of the customers were suppressing laughter, while a few openly chuckled at the sight of the once arrogant woman completely unraveling. Shaq simply folded his massive arms, looking down at her with an amused but firm expression. "Oh, I'm dead serious," he said, his deep voice carrying through the cafe. "You want to keep coming here? Then you got to earn it. You treat people like they're beneath you, so let's see how it feels to be on the other side." Karen's face turned bright red. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, shaking her head. "I'm not some minimum wage worker." Tyler, who had been watching the exchange with growing satisfaction, took a step forward and crossed his arms. Well, Karen, since you practically own this place, he said, mimicking her earlier words with a smirk, it shouldn't be a problem for you to learn how it actually runs. A ripple of laughter spread through the cafe. Karen clenched her fists, her body trembling with frustration. This is humiliating, she hissed under her breath. Shaq gave her a knowing look. Yeah, kind of like having coffee dumped on you for no reason, huh? Karen opened her mouth to argue, but she had nothing. She had embarrassed herself, not just in front of Shaq, but in front of an entire cafe full of people. And now she had to face the consequences. With a deep breath, she forced a tight-lipped smile and straightened her posture. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. I'll do it. One shift. The cafe burst into cheers and applause. Shaq nodded in approval. That's the spirit. He turned to Tyler. You got an extra apron for her? Tyler grinned and reached behind the counter, pulling out a brown Bean Haven apron. He tossed it to Karen, who fumbled to catch it. Hope you're good at taking orders, he said, smirking. Karen glared at him, but she knew she had no choice. She slipped the apron over her designer blouse, her hands shaking slightly as she tied it around her waist. As she turned to face the cafe, she saw the expectant faces of the customers, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. They were ready to see her squirm, and Karen had a terrible feeling she was about to give them exactly what they wanted. Karen's hands trembled as she reached for the notepad and pen, her fingers barely gripping them. The line of customers stretched before her, each face filled with expectation. Some amused, others eager to see her struggle. She swallowed hard, forcing a tight-lipped smile as she looked at the first customer, a young woman with a knowing smirk. Welcome to Bean Haven. What can I get you? Karen asked, her voice lacking the confidence it carried just minutes ago. The woman tilted her head, pretending to think. Let's see. How about a caramel macchiato? Oh, and make sure it's extra hot. Wouldn't want it to spill, you know. A few customers chuckled. Karen clenched her jaw but nodded, writing down the order. One caramel macchiato, she mumbled. She turned toward the espresso machine, her movements stiff and unnatural. Tyler stood beside her, leaning against the counter with an infuriatingly smug grin. Need some help? He asked. Karen's pride burned, but she didn't have a choice. Yes, she admitted begrudgingly. Tyler quickly showed her the basics. How to pull the espresso shot, steam the milk, and layer it correctly. Karen watched, biting the inside of her cheek, frustrated that something so simple could feel so difficult. All right, your turn, Tyler said, stepping back. Karen hesitated before attempting the process. Her hands were unsteady as she reached for the milk pitcher, and as soon as she tried to pour, a splash of hot liquid sloshed over the edge, right onto her blouse. She gasped, stepping back in shock as the warmth spread across the expensive fabric. Laughter erupted from the cafe. Shaq, who had been watching from a nearby table, leaned back in his chair, grinning. Karma's funny, huh? He said, shaking his head. Karen's face burned red with embarrassment, but she had no choice except to keep going. Gritting her teeth, she wiped herself off and went back to the machine. This time, with shaky precision, she managed to pour the drink, albeit sloppily, and place it on the counter. Caramel macchiato, she announced, hoping that was the end of it. The customer lifted the cup and raised an eyebrow. There's no caramel in this. Karen's stomach dropped. What? The woman held up the drink. Yeah, kind of an important part of a caramel macchiato. More laughter. Before Karen could react, the front door swung open, and a man with a camera stepped inside. The cafe fell into a hush. A reporter adjusted the mic in his hand and cleared his throat. Is it true Karen Whitman got humbled by Shaq? The internet works fast, but nothing spreads faster than justice served with a side of karma. By the time Karen finally stumbled into the break room of Bean Haven, exhausted and humiliated, the damage had already been done. What started as a few customers recording her fumbling through orders had turned into something much bigger. A Twitter user had uploaded the first clip. Wealthy woman mocks Shaq, spills coffee on him, then gets forced to work at his cafe. Within minutes, it had thousands of retweets. Then more videos surfaced, Karen stammering through orders, spilling coffee on herself, and worst of all, the moment she smugly declared that she practically owned the place before Shaq revealed he was the real owner. By the time Karen pulled out her phone, her notifications were a relentless, never-ending stream of comments, reposts, and news articles. Her breath hitched as she saw the trending tab. Number Karen gets served right below it. Another tag. Number Shaq humbles. The entitled, her fingers shook as she clicked on the first video. The caption made her stomach twist. Racist woman gets instant karma after disrespecting Shaq. She watched in horror as the entire encounter replayed before her eyes. Her own voice, dripping with arrogance. The way she had looked Shaq up and down with disgust. The moment she smugly dumped coffee on him as if he were beneath her. And then came the reactions. This is the most satisfying thing I've ever seen. She really thought she was above everyone until she got a taste of her own medicine. Shaq handled this like a king. This is how you humble the entitled. Karen's face turned ghostly pale. She scrolled through the comments, her breathing shallow. Does anyone know who she is? We need a name. I heard she's a socialite. Hope her rich friends see this. Imagine embarrassing yourself like this in front of Shaq. A new post popped up. A local news station had picked up the story. The headline made her stomach lurch. Shaquille O'Neal puts arrogant woman in her place. Internet reacts. Her vision blurred. Her carefully constructed social image, the wealthy connections she had prided herself on, were slipping through her fingers like sand. And then, the notification she had been dreading most. A message from her country club. Karen, we need to talk about your recent behavior. Effective immediately, your membership is under review. Her grip tightened on her phone. From across the cafe, Shaq leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee with an amused smirk. He had seen all this before. The downfall of someone who thought their money could shield them from consequences. Karen let out a shaky breath, her eyes darting around as if searching for a way out. Then she whispered almost to herself, "Oh my God, what have I done?" Karen sat at the small break room table, her hands clasped together tightly as if she were holding on to the last bit of control she had left. Her phone, still lighting up with notifications, lay face down on the table, as if ignoring it could undo the damage. The past hour had unraveled everything she thought she knew about herself. She had always been the one in power, the one who dictated how people should treat her. But now she was at the mercy of the very people she had dismissed. Shaq leaned against the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, watching her with an expression that was neither cruel nor smug, just patient. He had seen people like her before, the type who thought wealth meant superiority, but he also knew when someone was finally starting to see the truth. Karen swallowed hard before speaking. I shouldn't have done that." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Which part?" She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "All of it," she admitted. "I acted entitled. I thought I could do whatever I wanted because—" She stopped, as if embarrassed to say the words out loud. "Because you're rich?" Shaq finished for her. Karen flinched but nodded. For the first time all day, she wasn't trying to argue. She wasn't trying to manipulate her way out. She was just accepting. Shaq studied her for a moment before stepping into the room. "You know, money doesn't mean a damn thing if you don't know how to treat people," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Respect isn't about power. It's about how you carry yourself, how you treat others when no one's watching." Karen looked down, the weight of his words sinking in. "I get that now," she muttered. "Do you?" Shaq challenged. "Or are you just sorry you got caught?" Her lips parted as if she wanted to argue. But then she stopped herself. Finally, she shook her head. "No, I really get it," she said, her voice softer, humbled. Shaq nodded, pushing off the wall. "Good, because life has a way of humbling people who don't." Karen stood up slowly, brushing her hands against her expensive skirt as if trying to compose herself. She glanced at him one last time, eyes filled with something unfamiliar, genuine regret. I appreciate the lesson," she said hesitantly. Shaq smiled, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was a knowing smile. "Now you understand respect." Without another word, Karen turned and walked out of the cafe, her head lower than when she had entered. She wasn't the same woman who had strutted in that morning, and she knew she never would be again. The morning rush at Bean Haven had never felt more electric. The usual hum of coffee machines and soft chatter, was now accompanied by something new, a sense of warmth, of inclusion. The cafe, once a quiet hub for the city's elite, now welcomed everyone with open arms. Shaq sat in his usual corner, sipping a dark roast as he watched the cafe thrive under his leadership. The energy had shifted. The employees who once worked in hushed anxiety under Karen's presence now moved with ease, cracking jokes and smiling freely. The regulars noticed the difference, too. The place felt lighter. "Morning, Mr. O'Neill." Tyler greeted him with a grin, wiping his hands on his apron. "Another good day?" Shaq nodded, setting his mug down. "Best one yet." Tyler chuckled, leaning in slightly. "And Karen?" Shaq smirked, shaking his head. "Haven't seen her since." It was true, after her humiliating downfall, Karen Whitman had vanished. No more entitled outbursts, no more belittling staff. It was as if she had never existed within these walls. The viral video of her downfall had sealed her fate, and she knew better than to return. But Shaq didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The real victory wasn't in humiliating her. It was in changing the space she had once dominated. A few feet away, a group of young baristas were laughing as they prepped drinks for customers. An elderly man in a flannel jacket sat by the window, reading a newspaper. A group of teenagers occupied a corner booth, talking animatedly over iced lattes. The cafe had become what it should have always been, a place for everyone. A customer approached Shaq hesitantly. "Excuse me, sir," the young woman said, holding out a napkin. "Would you mind signing this? My dad's been a fan of yours forever." Shaq grinned, taking the napkin and scribbling his signature before handing it back. "Tell your dad I said hi." The woman beamed. "Thank you." As she walked off, Tyler exhaled, shaking his head. "Man, I still can't believe you own this place." Shaq took another sip of coffee, his eyes scanning the room. "Ownership's just a title," he said. "It's what you do with it that matters." Tyler nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the words. Just then, the cafe doors swung open, and a group of new customers entered, their faces filled with curiosity. Shaq stood, stretching as he looked around. "Welcome to Bean Haven," he said with a smile, "where everyone is treated with respect." And with that, he walked out, leaving behind a cafe forever changed, not by money, but by something far greater.